Hi everybody, my name is Christina Dolinar and I'm a Janome educator. Today we are going to talk all about yarn couching. And let's take a look at a few samples first to see exactly what yarn couching is. If we take a quick look at the back of this denim jacket, doesn't this look like a varsity letter? This is actually a letter that was stitched onto the back of the jacket using yarn couching. Doesn't that look rich and exciting like a true varsity letter? If we take a look at this pillow, doesn't this pillow remind you of one of Grandma's old chenille bedspreads? So you can easily recreate this appearance for pillows, even bedspreads and blankets and quilts that you might be making. And it gives you all that nice fuzzy texture like a chenille bedspread. You can also see the pillow that says home. You can recreate those pillows that you might purchase at a department store and simply make them your own. Now let's talk about how we set up our Janomes for yarn couching. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the presser foot that we're going to use. You can do yarn couching both in free motion and embroidery. First, we're going to talk about the free motion side. And of course, let's talk about the presser foot that we're going to be using. You'll see that we have this free motion couching set. So it's a free motion foot, and here is one right here. It goes on like a traditional free motion foot with this little bar going above the needle screw, but the important part is the hole that is in the presser foot. That hole is designed to accommodate the yarn that you're wanting to use. And this free motion couching set means that there are actually two different feet. They are interchangeable by addressing and adjusting this little screw and putting on the foot that will best accommodate the yarn that you want to use. Inside the packaging of your yarn couching foot, it gives you some great tips. It's going to talk about how you are actually going to be doing your free motion with a zigzag stitch. Yes, believe it or not, a little zigzag stitch. And we'll talk about how to be comfortable with that. It shares with you some tips about the thread that you're going to be using in your needle, and also how to get started. And simply drawing a simple design on your fabric and then following it with your yarn is the perfect way to get started. Some of our Janomes come with yarn guides. And this is a yarn guide that is for the Janome Continental M17. And this will actually sit right up here. It'll snap on right there. And the yarn is fed through right on this little hook. And it helps to provide that slack as you're doing your stitching, whether it's free motion or embroidery. Some of our other models have this little guide. And this guide actually snaps into the secondary spool pin hole, and it will allow that yarn to feed evenly and smoothly and out of the way and keep it positioned perfectly for your stitching. If you love gloves for your free motion, please of course use them. These are some fun little gloves that I personally like to use. And you can see how they just easily wrap around my hands. And the fingers, your fingers are still available to pick up scissors, answer the phone, change a stitch, or do other work, but the grippiness on the palm is perfect to help accommodate you doing your free motion. Now let's take a look at the screen of our Janome and see how we actually set our Janome up for free motion yarn couching. To set your Janome up for free motion yarn couching, we are simply going to go into sewing applications. This is where Janome has selected the perfect stitch stitch length, presser foot pressure, and thread tension for a wide variety of common sewing and quilting techniques. On some of our Janomes, you are going to go into your quilting applications. There is an icon that says free motion, and you have the option to do zigzag free motion. If you take a look at your instructions in the presser foot, you'll see that it'll talk about adjusting the width of your zigzag stitch to accommodate the thickness of your yarn. And you, of course, will use the free motion couching foot. On the Continental M17, there is automatically a setting for yarn couching. This icon that looks like a foot with a plus sign next to it. If we arrow over to the next screen, here is free motion couching. It's showing us the foot that we're going to use, and there are your two options, and the two options differ with respect to the size of the hole that is in the presser foot. So in other words, the thickness of the yarn that you're using. So now let's set up our presser foot and do some yarn couching. So if you take a look at our Janome CM17, we do have the yarn couching foot already on. Now, this is some boucle yarn that I have. Once the band was taken off, it just expanded, of course. This is a little fuzzy type of yarn. And many of you, if you knit or crochet, you might have partial skeins of yarn left over. So I'm going to encourage you to just experiment and experience the different types of yarn that you have and see what texture and appearance you like best with the yarns that you have in your house. So to set this up, the yarn couching up, we of course have our yarn guide up here on the mast. So our yarn will come over here. And now to easily put the yarn into the yarn couching foot, there is actually a little slot. And if you just take your yarn like dental floss, and it'll snap right in there, just like that. So now you're all threaded. Now, as you are doing your yarn couching, you want to make certain that there is always slack in your yarn. If it ever gets really taut and not loose, then you might be skipping some stitches and stitching the yarn down just because the yarn is tight and it's not where it needs to be as you're doing your stitching. Now, to create that Letterman J, this was just simply a little stencil that we printed out from our computer, one of those many fonts that are in your computers. Created this little stencil, and here you can see that we've traced that letter J onto our fabric. You're going to want to use some type of stabilizer for your fabric. Here, we just have a piece of cutaway stabilizer. If you were putting this letter maybe on a pillow, you might put some batting behind there. Just something to give your fabric a little extra support. Now let's do some stitching. So we'll put our fabric underneath there. It really does not matter where you start on your project. But in free motion on your Janomes, the very first thing your Janome will do is a single stitch so you can pull up your bobbin thread. Okay, I'm just going to let that bobbin thread go though. And now just do some free motion stitching. And wherever you stitch, the yarn will follow. Your hands are going to, in essence, act kind of like a hoop as you're doing your stitching. And remember, we are set on a slight zigzag stitch. And I understand any concern, well, can I really use a zigzag stitch with this? If you just want to turn your hand wheel so it stitches a whole revolution of your stitch, you'll be able to see that it will easily accommodate that zigzag stitch. Okay? So let's do some stitching. And you can see how that yarn is just feeding itself exactly where it needs to be. There's no right or wrong way or direction or order to stitch this. You might want to do that outline of the letter first. You can see it's starting to begin to take shape, can't you? And just make certain that your yarn is always loose. So now you can just continue stitching back and forth and creating and filling in the letter J. You can go over that same stitching area multiple times to give it that real built-up texture that you see like on varsity letters. This is so much fun, and some folks will say, well, I'm not really good at free motion. The beautiful part is that no one will be able to tell if you're good or not with free motion, because you're couching that yarn down and everything in essence is hidden, and no one's going to see your stitching because of the great yarn that you're stitching. So now let's change our presser foot so that we can talk about using the thicker thread or the thicker yarn for our project. We'll simply touch our scissor button. That, of course, cut the thread, but we need scissors to physically cut the yarn. Now, when you're done stitching, what you can do with this yarn, you can do a couple things. You could simply just cut it right there. That is not going to ravel or fray away. Or you could use a large eye sewing needle and pull this thread tail to the back side and just leave it hang there. No one will never know that it's there. But now we're going to change our presser foot so that we can accommodate that thicker yarn. And remember, since there are in essence 2 feet with this set of feet, we'll simply loosen this screw right here so that we can put on the larger hole to accommodate the thicker yarn. So now we're going to talk about using the yarn couching foot with a thicker yarn. And that's that yarn that we used here on this fun pillow that gives it that chenille effect. Now remember, your yarn couching foot set comes with 2 different feet. They differ with respect to the size of the hole that is in that foot. So the larger hole, of course, can accommodate a thicker yarn. Now, just because your yarn is a little fluffy, I always recommend that you try putting that yarn in the foot and making sure that it pulls through evenly or nicely. So it's not really getting hung up, it feeds through smoothly. So once again, to attach that yarn into that foot, it's kind of like snapping it in. So on this left-hand side of the foot is a little slot that will now allow you to put that yarn in there with ease. So once again, we're going to do the single stitch. So you could pull up the bobbin thread if you'd like. And now we're just going to make one of those mod flowers, kind of like the 70s flowers, using this fun, thick chenille yarn. So we're going to start stitching. And now what you might want to do is address this yarn tail. And I'm just going to use some thread snips to snip this part off, okay? We don't need to do anything with this or worry about what that yarn's going to do because that end is going to get covered easily. So now, just doing that 5-petal flower that many of us, I think, can easily draw. 1, 2. There's our 3rd petal, 4th petal, and 5th. Now what are we going to do in the middle? We're just going to do a little spiral. So just stitching. And now all that yarn has filled the center of our flower. We'll use the scissor button to cut our threads. And of course, it's not going to cut our yarn, so we'll just snip this yarn. And there's our flower. Now you can easily, once again, just cut this yarn, or you could take a big eye needle and pull it to the back side, but we're just going to snip this here, and there's our 70s flower, just like that old-fashioned chenille bedspread. I hope you give yarn couching in the free motion mode a try. It's a whole lot of fun.